The first lick of orange flame appeared in the corner of Hannah Ashford's vision, just as she stepped out of the barn with a bucket of fresh milk. And by the time her mind registered what she was seeing, half her cabin was already engulfed in fire that roared like a living thing against the darkening Wyoming sky. She dropped the bucket and ran, her boots kicking up dust as she sprinted toward the only home she had known since her parents died 2 years ago. But the heat hit her like a wall 20 feet from the door, forcing her back with tears streaming down her face from smoke and grief. Everything she owned was in there. Every photograph, every letter, every memory of the life she had built alone on this patch of land just outside Kelton, Utah, where she had moved last spring hoping for a fresh start. The flames climbed higher, crackling and spitting embers into the twilight, and Hannah could only stand there with her hands pressed to her mouth, watching her entire world burn. She did not see the riders approaching until they were nearly upon her, 3 men on horseback silhouetted against the burning building, and the one in front tipped his hat with a smile that made her stomach turn cold despite the heat. Cyrus Maddock owned half the valley and wanted the other half, and Hannah had refused to sell to him 4 times in the past 6 months. Now she understood why he had stopped asking. "Shame about your place," Maddock called out, not bothering to dismount. "Dry summer like this, fire can start from anything." A lantern tipped over, a spark from the stove. "I was outside," Hannah said, her voice shaking with fury rather than fear. "The stove was cold. There was no lantern burning." Maddock shrugged, still smiling that awful smile. "Hard to prove anything now. But you know, Miss Ashford, a woman alone out here, no home, no resources, that's a dangerous situation. I am still willing to buy this land. $50 and you can move into town, start over somewhere safe." "This land is worth 10 times that, and you know it," Hannah said. "The creek runs year-round, the soil is good, and you want it because it cuts right through the middle of your holdings." $40 then," Maddock said, and the smile finally dropped from his face. "And that is my final offer. You have 3 days to accept before I withdraw it entirely." He wheeled his horse around, and his men followed, leaving Hannah alone with the burning wreckage of her life. She sank down into the dirt, hugging her knees to her chest, and watched the flames consume the cabin her father had built with his own hands before they moved here, the cabin she had loved despite its drafts and creaking floors. The barn was untouched, and the chicken coop, and the small shed where she kept tools, but without shelter she could not stay through winter, and winter in this part of Utah came early and stayed late. She was still sitting there an hour later when she heard another horse approach, and this time she scrambled to her feet with her hand reaching for the rifle that had burned with everything else. But the rider who emerged from the darkness held his hands up, showing he was unarmed, and when he came close enough for the firelight to illuminate his face, Hannah recognized him as one of the ranch hands from the Sutton place, the big spread about 5 miles west. "Miss Ashford," he said, swinging down from his horse with easy grace. "I saw the smoke from the ridge. Are you hurt?" "No," Hannah said, though her throat ached from smoke and unshed tears, "but everything else is gone." He was tall, this cowboy, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes that reflected the dying fire like burnished copper. Hannah had seen him in town a few times, always polite, always keeping to himself, and she knew his name was Henry Sutton, nephew to the ranch owner. But they had never spoken more than a few words. Now he stood looking at the smoking ruins of her cabin with his jaw tight and his hands clenched at his sides. "This was not an accident," he said, "and it was not a question." "No," Hannah agreed. "Cyrus Maddock wants my land. He made that very clear." Henry turned to look at her, and there was something fierce in his expression that made her breath catch. Did he threaten you? Not in so many words, but the message was plain enough. You cannot stay here, Henry said, glancing around at the empty darkness beyond the firelight. Not tonight, not alone. You will stay with me for now. My uncle has plenty of room at the ranch, and we can figure out what to do in the morning. Hannah wanted to refuse, wanted to insist she could manage on her own, but the night was growing cold and she had nowhere to go and no resources to get there. Pride was a luxury she could not afford, not anymore. I do not want to impose, she said quietly. You are not imposing. You are accepting help from a neighbor, which is what people do out here. Henry's voice was firm but kind, and when he held out his hand, Hannah took it and let him help her up onto his horse. She settled behind the saddle, and he swung up in front of her, and Hannah had to put her arms around his waist to keep from sliding off as they started forward into the darkness. She could feel the solid warmth of him through his shirt, could smell leather and sage and honest sweat. And despite everything that had happened, despite the loss and the fear and the anger churning inside her, she felt a small spark of something else, something she had not allowed herself to feel in the 2 years since she had decided to make her own way in the world without depending on any man. But she pushed it down, buried it deep, because this was not the time and Henry Sutton was just being kind, nothing more. The Sutton Ranch appeared after about 30 minutes of riding, a sprawling collection of buildings lit by lanterns hung on porch posts, and Henry guided the horse right up to the main house, a 2-story structure that looked solid and prosperous in the yellow light. An older man with a weathered face and sharp eyes stepped out onto the porch, and Hannah recognized him as Thomas Sutton, who had built this ranch from nothing over 30 years ago. Henry, Thomas said, his eyes moving from his nephew to Hannah with open curiosity. What happened? Fire at the Ashford place, Henry said, dismounting and then reaching up to help Hannah down. His hands were strong and steady at her waist, and he did not let go until her feet were firmly on the ground. The whole cabin burned. Miss Ashford needs a place to stay. Thomas's expression darkened. Maddock? Most likely, Henry said. That snake. Thomas shook his head and then gestured toward the door. Come in, miss. You are welcome here as long as you need. Henry, take her upstairs to the blue room. I will have Rosa bring up some food and water for washing. The inside of the house was warm and comfortable, furnished with heavy wooden furniture and woven rugs, and Hannah followed Henry up a wide staircase to a room that was bigger than her entire cabin had been. There was a real bed with a quilted coverlet, a washstand with a porcelain basin, a rocking chair by the window, and curtains that looked like they had been made by someone who cared about such things. This is too much, Hannah protested, but Henry shook his head. It is just a room and it has been sitting empty for months. You will be doing us a favor by using it. He paused in the doorway, his hand on the frame. Try to get some rest. We will talk in the morning about what to do next. After he left, Hannah sank down onto the bed and finally let herself cry, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body as the shock and grief and fear crashed over her all at once. She cried until there were no tears left, and then she washed her face in the basin of water that a kind-faced older woman brought up along with a tray of bread and cold chicken and apple pie. She ate because her body needed fuel, not because she tasted anything. And then she lay down on top of the covers fully dressed and stared at the ceiling until exhaustion dragged her down into sleep. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee drifting up from downstairs, and for one confused moment she forgot where she was and why. Then memory returned like a physical blow, and she sat up with her heart pounding and her hands shaking. She had nothing left. No home, no clothes except what she wore, no money except the $20 hidden in the coffee tin that had melted in the fire. She had the land itself, but without a house or barn or equipment, the land was just empty space that she could not work or defend. There was a knock on the door, and the same woman from last night entered carrying a bundle of clothing. "Morning, miss. I am Rosa. I brought you some things to wear. They belonged to Mr. Thomas's late wife, but she would want them used." Rosa's accent spoke of Mexico, and her eyes were warm with sympathy. "There is hot water in the kitchen when you are ready to wash properly." "Thank you," Hannah said, accepting the clothes with gratitude. The dress was simple calico in a blue that matched her eyes, and there was a clean shift and stockings, and even a pair of shoes that were only slightly too large. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, following the smell of coffee and frying bacon. The kitchen was huge, with a cast-iron stove that radiated heat and a long table where Henry and Thomas sat eating breakfast. Both men stood when she entered, and Henry pulled out a chair for her before she could protest. "How did you sleep?" Thomas asked as Rosa set a plate in front of Hannah piled high with eggs and bacon and fried potatoes. "Better than I expected," Hannah admitted. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Sutton. I will find a way to repay you. No need for that. Henry tells me Cyrus Maddock offered to buy your land. For a fraction of what it is worth, yes." Thomas exchanged a look with Henry, something passing between them that Hannah could not read. "Maddock has been trying to consolidate the whole valley for years. He thinks if he owns enough land, he can control the water rights and force everyone else out. Your property is the key piece because of the creek." "I know," Hannah said. "That is why I will not sell, not to him, but I do not know how I can hold on to it now. I have no money to rebuild, and I cannot survive winter in a barn." "You could file a claim with the territorial marshal," Henry suggested. "If Maddock burned your cabin, that is arson. He should be arrested." Hannah shook her head. "I have no proof. He was careful not to threaten me directly, and no one saw his men set the fire. It would be my word against his, and he has money and influence. I have neither." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the sizzle of bacon on the stove and the tick of the clock on the wall. Hannah forced herself to eat, though every bite felt like dust in her mouth, and she tried to think of a solution that did not involve giving up everything her parents had worked for. "You could stay here," Henry said suddenly, and both Hannah and Thomas looked at him in surprise. "Work for the ranch, I mean. We need help with the cooking and the garden and the chickens. Rosa cannot do it all alone, and it would give you a safe place to stay while you figure out your next move. We would pay you fair wages, and you could save up to rebuild." "Henry," Thomas said, a note of warning in his voice. "It makes sense, Uncle. We do need the help, and Miss Ashford needs work, and this way she stays close to her land, so Maddock cannot just move in and take it." Hannah looked between the two men, sensing an undercurrent she did not fully understand. "I would earn my keep," she said firmly. "I am not asking for charity. If you truly need help, I will work hard, and I will pay you back for room and board once I have money." Thomas studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but you will not pay us back. Wages and room and board, that is the deal. Rosa can show you what needs doing." Relief flooded through Hannah so intensely she felt dizzy with it. It was not a solution, not really, but it was a reprieve, time to breathe and think and plan. "Thank you," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "I will not let you down." After breakfast, Rosa took Hannah on a tour of the ranch, showing her the chicken coops where 24 hens scratched and clucked, the vegetable garden that sprawled behind the house in neat rows, the spring house where they kept milk and butter cool, and the laundry shed where clothes were scrubbed and boiled and hung to dry. There was more than enough work to keep 3 women busy, and Hannah threw herself into it with determination. grateful for the distraction. She spent the morning weeding the garden, her hands remembering the familiar rhythm of pulling unwanted plants and loosening soil around the vegetables. The sun climbed higher, turning the air hot and dry, and sweat soaked through her borrowed dress. But Hannah did not stop until Rosa called her in for the midday meal. She ate with the ranch hands at the long table in the kitchen. 8 men who worked the cattle and horses and land, all of them polite and respectful and clearly curious about the woman who had suddenly appeared in their midst. Henry sat at the far end of the table, and Hannah caught him watching her more than once, his expression thoughtful. She looked away each time, not wanting to encourage whatever he might be thinking, but she was acutely aware of him in a way she had never been aware of any man before. It was disconcerting and inappropriate given her circumstances, and she firmly told herself to stop being foolish. In the afternoon, Rosa taught her how Thomas liked his shirt starched and how to make the sourdough bread that was a staple at every meal. They worked side by side in the hot kitchen, and Rosa talked about her life, how she had come north from Mexico with her husband 20 years ago, how he had died in a riding accident, and Thomas had kept her on because he valued her cooking and her company. It was clear Rosa ran the house with quiet efficiency, and Hannah was grateful for her patience and kindness. As the sun began to set, Henry found Hannah in the chicken coop collecting eggs. "I am riding over to your place tomorrow," he said without preamble. "I want to see if anything survived the fire, and I want to check on your animals." "The animals," Hannah said, guilt crashing over her. In the chaos and grief, she had forgotten about her 2 goats and the old mare she had bought last spring. "Are they all right?" "I checked last night before I came back. The barn was not touched and I put out feed and water, but they will need tending." "I should come with you," Hannah said. "Can you ride?" Henry asked, and there was something almost like amusement in his eyes. "Of course I can ride. I am not some city girl who does not know one end of a horse from the other." "Good. We will leave after breakfast." That night, Hannah lay in the comfortable bed and stared at the ceiling again, but this time her mind was not on what she had lost, but on what she still had. The land was hers, legally filed and recorded, and Maddock could not take it without her signature on a deed. As long as she refused to sell, as long as she stayed close enough to watch over it, he could not claim it was abandoned. It was not much, but it was something. And there was Henry, who had offered help without asking for anything in return, who had looked at her burned cabin with anger on her behalf, who watched her with those copper-colored eyes like he was trying to figure out a puzzle. She did not know what to make of him, this quiet cowboy who seemed to see more than most people, and she told herself it did not matter because she could not afford distractions. But as she drifted off to sleep, it was Henry's face she saw in her mind, and the memory of his hands steady at her waist. The ride to her property the next morning took longer than Hannah remembered, or perhaps it just felt longer because she was dreading what she would find. Henry had saddled a gentle mare for her, and they rode in comfortable silence through the early morning cool, the sun just beginning to burn off the mist that clung to the low places. When her land came into view, Hannah had to bite her lip to keep from crying again. The cabin was nothing but a blackened skeleton of beams and a pile of ash, still smoking faintly in the morning air. The porch where she had sat so many evenings watching the sunset was gone. The rocking chair her father had made reduced to charcoal. But the barn stood intact, and so did the shed and the chicken coop, and when Hannah dismounted and walked to the creek, it burbled along as clear and cold as ever, indifferent to human tragedy. "I am sorry," Henry said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "I know this does not help, but I am sorry this happened to you." "It is not your fault," Hannah said. "It is Maddock's fault, and he will pay for it somehow. I do not know how yet, but he will." They spent the morning sorting through the ruins, but there was almost nothing to salvage. A few metal pots, the iron stove itself cracked from the heat, some tools from the shed that had escaped the flames. Henry loaded everything useful onto his pack-horse while Hannah tended to her animals, relieved to find them healthy and calm. The mare nickered at her approach, and the goats butted their heads against her legs in greeting, and Hannah felt tears prick her eyes at their simple affection. "I will bring them back to the ranch," Henry said. "We have plenty of pasture, and your mare can go in with our horses." "I cannot keep accepting your charity," Hannah protested, but Henry shook his head. "It is not charity. You are working for us, remember? These are your animals and they need care. Once you rebuild, you can take them home again." Rebuild. The word felt impossible, a dream too big to contemplate. But Hannah nodded anyway because the alternative was to give up. And she had not survived 24 years and the death of both parents, and 2 years alone on the frontier, just to surrender now. They were preparing to leave when they saw riders approaching, and Hannah's stomach clenched when she recognized Cyrus Maddock at the front. He had 2 men with him again, both wearing gun belts slung low, and the smile on Maddock's face made Hannah want to hit him. "Miss Ashford," Maddock said, tipping his hat in a mockery of courtesy. "I came to see how you were managing. Terrible thing, that fire." "Yes, it was," Hannah said, her voice cold. "Terrible and deliberate." Maddock's smile thinned. "That is a serious accusation. You should be careful about making claims you cannot prove." "And you should be careful about underestimating me," Hannah shot back. "I am not selling, Mr. Maddock. Not now, not ever, not to you." "That is foolish, Miss Ashford. You have no house, no resources. Winter is coming. How do you plan to survive? That is none of your concern." Maddock's eyes shifted to Henry, who had moved to stand slightly in front of Hannah, his hand resting casually on his belt near his own gun. "Sutton, I heard you were poking your nose into business that does not concern you." "Arson and threatening a woman concerns everyone," Henry said evenly. "And if you think you are going to bully Miss Ashford off her land, you are mistaken. Big words from a ranch hand. I am not just a ranch hand. This ranch belongs to my uncle, which means it will belong to me someday. And the Suttons have been in this valley longer than you have. We do not take kindly to men who use violence to get what they want." The 2 men stared at each other, and the air felt charged with the kind of tension that could explode into violence at any moment. Hannah's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stand still to not show fear. Finally, Maddock looked away, his jaw tight. "This is not over," he said, and wheeled his horse around. His men followed, and the 3 of them rode off in a cloud of dust. "You should not have provoked him," Hannah said once they were gone, but her voice shook slightly. "He needed to know you are not alone," Henry replied. "Men like Maddock are cowards. They only attack when they think they can get away with it. If he knows the Sutton Ranch is watching, he will think twice. Or he will escalate," Hannah said. "He could come after your ranch next. Let him try." There was steel in Henry's voice, and when Hannah looked up at him, she saw that same fierce expression from the night of the fire. "I meant what I said. We do not tolerate bullies." They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, charged with unspoken things. Hannah was hyper-aware of Henry riding beside her, of the way he sat his horse with easy confidence, of the way he had stepped between her and Maddock without hesitation. She barely knew this man, but he had already done more for her than anyone since her parents died, and she did not know how to process the gratitude and attraction and fear of depending on someone all tangled up inside her. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Hannah worked from dawn until dark, helping Rosa with cooking and cleaning and laundry, tending the garden and the chickens. learning the dozens of small tasks that kept the ranch running smoothly. She earned her keep and then some, and Thomas made a point of telling her so, which soothed some of her pride. The ranch hands accepted her presence, and a few of them even seemed protective of her, especially after word spread about what Maddock had done. Henry was harder to read. He was polite and helpful, always ready to lend a hand or offer advice, but he kept a certain distance that made Hannah think he was deliberately holding back. She told herself she was glad, that the last thing she needed was romantic entanglement when her life was such chaos. But she could not help watching for him at meals, could not help the way her pulse jumped when he walked into a room. 2 weeks after the fire, Thomas called Hannah into his study after dinner. It was a masculine space, all dark wood and leather with a big desk covered in papers and ledgers. He gestured for her to sit, and Hannah perched on the edge of the chair, nervous without knowing why. "I want to talk to you about your land," Thomas said without preamble. "Henry tells me you are determined to keep it." "I am," Hannah said firmly. "It is all I have left of my family. I understand that, but keeping it and being able to use it are two different things. You need a house, equipment, seed for next year's crops. That takes money." "I know. I am saving my wages." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her. "At the wages I am paying you, it would take 3 years to save enough. And that is assuming Maddock does not cause more trouble in the meantime." Hannah's heart sank. She had been trying not to think about the math, but hearing it laid out so plainly made the impossibility of her situation clear. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting a partnership. You deed half your land to the Sutton Ranch, and we provide the money and materials to build you a new house and barn. We run cattle on the land, and you get a share of the profits. When you are back on your feet, you can buy the land back if you want, or we can continue the partnership. Either way, you keep a home and Maddock does not get what he wants." It was a generous offer, more generous than Hannah had any right to expect, but it also meant giving up half of what her parents had worked for. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course. Take your time. But do not take too long. Maddock is not a patient man, and winter is 6 weeks away." Hannah left the study with her head spinning. She walked out into the cool evening air and found herself drifting toward the corral where the horses stood in the gathering dusk. Her mare was there, looking content among the other animals, and Hannah leaned on the fence rail and tried to sort through her tangled thoughts. "He made you the offer," Henry said, and Hannah turned to find him leaning against the fence a few feet away. She had not heard him approach. "How did you know?" "It was my idea." Henry pushed off the fence and came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "I know it is not what you want, but it is better than losing everything." "Is it?" Hannah asked. "Or is it just another way for someone to take my land?" "My uncle is not Cyrus Maddock," Henry said, and there was an edge to his voice. "He is offering you a fair deal and he will honor it, but if you would rather struggle alone out of pride, that is your choice." "That is not fair," Hannah protested. "This is not about pride. It is about keeping the only thing I have left. And what good is keeping it if you freeze to death in a barn come January?" Henry's voice rose slightly, frustration breaking through his usual calm. "You are so determined to do everything yourself that you cannot see when someone is trying to help you." "I have had to do everything myself," Hannah shot back. "I am 24 years old, and I have been alone since I was 22. I do not have the luxury of depending on other people." "You are not alone anymore," Henry said, and suddenly his voice was quiet again, intense. "You have not been alone since the night I found you standing in front of that fire. I do not know why you cannot see that." They stared at each other in the fading light, and Hannah's breath caught at the look in Henry's eyes. It was not pity or mere kindness. It was something deeper, something that made her heart race and her hands tremble. She wanted to look away but found she could not, and when Henry reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, she did not pull back. "I should go inside," she whispered, but she did not move. "Probably," Henry agreed, but he did not move either. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and fear, and then Rosa's voice called from the house that it was time to help with supper preparations. The spell broke, and Hannah stepped back, her cheeks flushing. "Thank you for your advice," she said formally. "I will consider the offer." She fled before he could respond, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She had not let herself feel anything like this in years, had not allowed herself to want anything beyond survival and independence. And now, Henry Sutton had cracked something open inside her that she did not know how to close again. That night she lay awake for hours, torn between stubborn pride and practical necessity, between fear of depending on anyone and the growing certainty that she was not going to be able to rebuild alone. And underneath it all was the memory of Henry's hand at her face, gentle and sure, and the look in his eyes that suggested he saw her as more than just a woman who needed help. In the morning, she found Thomas in his study and accepted his offer. He drew up the papers right there, and Hannah signed her name with a hand that shook only slightly, watching half her inheritance pass into Sutton ownership. It hurt, but it also felt like a door opening, like she was choosing survival over stubbornness, and maybe that was a kind of wisdom. "We will start building next week," Thomas said, shaking her hand. "Henry will oversee the work. He has a good eye for construction. Of course it would be Henry." Hannah was not sure if that made things easier or harder, but she nodded and went back to her work, trying not to think about spending the next several weeks working closely with a man who made her feel things she had sworn off feeling. The construction started on a cool morning in late September, and Hannah rode out with Henry and 4 ranch hands to her property. They had brought a wagon loaded with lumber and tools, and Henry had sketched out plans for a small but solid cabin, bigger than the one that burned but not so large it would take all winter to build. "Here," Henry said, handing Hannah the plans. "Tell me if you want anything changed." She studied the drawing, seeing a main room with a fireplace, a small bedroom, a pantry, and a covered porch. It was practical and efficient, and she could see herself living there, making it a home again. "It is perfect," she said. "Thank you." The work was hard and physical, and Henry insisted Hannah help with the lighter tasks, teaching her how to measure and cut and nail boards together. She learned quickly, her hands growing calloused and strong, and there was satisfaction in seeing the cabin take shape under their combined efforts. They worked side by side from sunup to sundown, taking breaks only for water and the lunch Rosa packed for them, and slowly, inevitably, they began to talk. Henry told her about growing up on the ranch, about his parents who had died in a cholera outbreak when he was 15, about how his uncle had taken him in and taught him everything about ranching and life. Hannah told him about her own parents, about the farm in Kansas where she had grown up, about the drought that had killed their crops and her father's decision to move west for a fresh start. They talked about books and horses and the best way to make biscuits, about politics and weather and dreams for the future. And somewhere in those conversations, between the sound of hammers and the smell of fresh cut wood, Hannah fell in love. She did not mean to. She had not planned on it. But love did not ask permission, and it crept up on her in the way Henry listened when she talked, really listened, like her words mattered. It showed itself in the way he made sure she ate enough at lunch, the way he steadied the ladder when she climbed up to nail boards near the roof line, the way he smiled at her jokes and took her opinion seriously. It was in 1,000 small kindnesses and moments of connection. And by the time Hannah recognized it for what it was far too late to protect her heart. The cabin walls were up when the first snow fell, a light dusting that melted by midday but served as a warning that winter was coming fast. They worked faster after that, racing against the weather, and the other ranch hands pitched in during their spare time, turning the project into a community effort. Hannah was overwhelmed by the generosity, by these rough men who barely knew her giving their time and skill to help her rebuild. "This is what neighbors do," Henry said when she tried to thank him for the 100th time. "We take care of each other. That is how people survive out here." The cabin was finished 3 days before the first real snowstorm hit, and Hannah walked through the empty rooms with tears in her eyes, running her hands over the smooth wood walls and the sturdy door and the fireplace that Henry had built with river stones. It was smaller than the original cabin but somehow felt more like hers because she had helped build it with her own hands. "What do you think?" Henry asked, standing in the doorway watching her. "I think it is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," Hannah said honestly. "I do not know how to thank you. You do not need to thank me." Henry crossed the room to stand in front of her, and there was something in his expression that made Hannah's breath catch. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you really refuse to sell to Maddock? The truth." Hannah considered lying, considered giving him some noble speech about legacy and principle, but she was tired of hiding behind walls. "Because if I sold, I would have nothing. No home, no purpose, no reason to keep going. That land was the only thing tying me to this world, and I was afraid if I let it go, I would just drift away into nothing. And now," Henry asked softly, "now I have this." Hannah gestured at the cabin around them. "And I have work I am good at and people who have been kind to me." She paused, gathering courage. "And I have you if I am reading this correctly. If I am wrong, please tell me now so I can stop making a fool of myself." Henry's face broke into a smile, the first real, unguarded smile Hannah had seen from him, and it transformed him from handsome to devastating. "You are not wrong," he said, and then he closed the distance between them and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, his lips soft against hers, his hand coming up to cup her face. But when Hannah made a small sound and leaned into him, the kiss deepened, became more urgent, and suddenly they were clinging to each other like drowning people, months of unspoken want pouring out in that connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Henry rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that since the first night," he admitted. "When I saw you standing there so brave in front of that fire, refusing to break even though your whole world was burning. I thought you were the strongest person I had ever met." "I am not that strong," Hannah said. "I was terrified. Being terrified and doing it anyway, that is the definition of strength." Henry kissed her again, slower this time, and Hannah let herself sink into it, let herself feel all the things she had been denying for weeks. When they finally rode back to the ranch that evening, something had shifted between them. Some invisible line crossed that could not be uncrossed. They held hands on the ride back, and when they dismounted in the yard, Henry kissed her again before heading to take care of the horses. Hannah walked into the house feeling like she was floating, and Rosa took one look at her face and smiled knowingly. "About time," was all she said, and Hannah laughed, giddy and light in a way she had not felt in years. Thomas noticed too, because nothing happened on his ranch without him knowing, but he just nodded in approval and said nothing. The other ranch hands teased Henry mercilessly at dinner, but it was good-natured, and Henry took it with grace, his hand finding Hannah's under the table and squeezing gently. That night, Henry walked Hannah up to her room, and they stood in the hallway talking in whispers until Rosa finally yelled at them to go to bed. Henry kissed her goodnight at her door, and Hannah went inside feeling like her heart might burst from happiness. She had been so focused on survival and independence that she had forgotten how good it felt to connect with someone, to let someone in past her defenses. The next morning, Cyrus Maddock rode onto Sutton land with 6 men at his back, all of them armed and looking for trouble. Thomas and Henry met them in the yard, and Hannah watched from the porch with her heart in her throat. "I heard you have been building on the Ashford land," Maddock said without preamble. "That is interesting, since Miss Ashford does not have the resources to build." "That is because we are partners now," Thomas said calmly. "The Sutton Ranch owns half that property, which means you will not be getting it." Maddock's face darkened. "You are interfering with my business. Your business of arson and intimidation. Yes, I suppose we are." "You cannot prove anything," Maddock spat. "And you are making a mistake, Sutton. I have friends in the territorial government. I can make things very difficult for you." "And I have friends in the Cattle Association and the Land Office," Thomas replied evenly. "Try your worst, Maddock. But if anything happens to Miss Ashford or to that cabin or to any part of that property, I will make sure every lawman from here to Denver knows you are responsible. Is that clear?" The 2 men stared at each other for a long, tense moment. Then Maddock jerked his horse's head around and rode off, his men trailing behind him. But the look he threw over his shoulder promised this was not over, and Hannah shivered despite the morning sun. "He is not going to give up," she said when Henry came to stand beside her on the porch. "Probably not, but he is not going to win either." Henry put his arm around her shoulders and Hannah leaned into his warmth. "We will figure it out." That afternoon, Henry took Hannah back to her property to start moving in furniture and supplies. They made several trips back and forth with the wagon, and by evening the little cabin had a bed and table and chairs, pots and pans, blankets and dishes. It still needed curtains and a dozen other small touches, but it was livable, a real home again. "When do you want to move in?" Henry asked as they stood on the porch watching the sun set over the valley. "I do not know," Hannah admitted. "Part of me wants to come right away to prove that I am not afraid, but another part of me does not want to leave the ranch." She glanced at him. "Does not want to leave you." "Then do not," Henry said simply. "Stay at the ranch. Come out here during the day to work the garden and tend your animals, but sleep at the ranch where it is safe and where I can see you every day. Your uncle will not mind. My uncle is the one who suggested it." Henry turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Hannah, I need you to understand something. This thing between us, it is not just passing attraction for me. I am falling in love with you, and I think you might be feeling the same way. So stay at the ranch. Give us time to figure out what this is without worrying about Maddock or isolation or anything else." Hannah's heart was beating so fast she felt dizzy. "I am feeling the same way," she whispered. "I tried not to, but I am." Henry pulled her close and kissed her, and Hannah wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the pent-up emotion of the past difficult weeks. They stood there on the porch of her new cabin as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and red, and Hannah felt something inside her settle, like a piece sliding into place where it belonged. The weeks that followed were the happiest Hannah could remember. She split her time between the ranch and her property, spending days working her land and evenings with Henry and the Sutton household. She and Henry stole moments alone whenever they could, riding out to check cattle and ending up kissing under the wide Wyoming sky, sitting together after dinner talking until the fire burned down to embers. They moved slowly, both of them cautious about rushing into something too fast, but the connection between them deepened with every conversation, every touch, every shared laugh, winter arrived in earnest in November, bringing snow that piled up in drifts and temperatures that dropped below zero. Hannah's cabin sat empty but secure, and she was grateful to be at the ranch where the big house stayed warm and there were people around. She learned to love the rhythm of ranch life, the early mornings and hard work, and simple pleasures of hot coffee and good food and friends who became family. Christmas came, and Rosa taught Hannah how to make tamales, and Thomas produced a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion. They all gathered around the big table in the kitchen, 8 ranch hands and Rosa and Thomas and Henry and Hannah, and they ate and drank and told stories until late into the night. Henry gave Hannah a pair of leather gloves he had sewn himself, and she gave him a shirt she had made from fabric she bought with her saved wages, and the looks they exchanged were worth more than gold. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Hannah and Henry sat in front of the fireplace in the main room, his arm around her and her head on his shoulder. The house was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the howl of wind outside. "I have been thinking," Henry said quietly, "about the future." "What about it?" Hannah asked, though her heart was already speeding up. "About you and me, about what we want." He shifted so he could look at her face. "Hannah, I know we have not been together long, and I know you value your independence. But I cannot imagine my life without you in it anymore, so I need to know if you feel the same or if I am getting ahead of myself." Hannah sat up, her pulse racing. "What are you asking me, Henry?" "I am asking if you would consider marrying me." "Not right away, not until you are ready, but someday, because I love you and I want to build a life with you." Tears sprang to Hannah's eyes, but they were happy tears, the kind that came from overwhelming emotion. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I would consider it. I would more than consider it. I love you too, and I want that life." Henry's face broke into that smile that always made her heart stutter, and he pulled her into his arms and kissed her until they were both breathless and laughing. They sat there for hours, making plans and dreaming out loud, talking about combining their properties, about the children they might have someday, about growing old together on the land they both loved. When Hannah finally went up to bed, she felt like she was walking on air. Everything that had seemed impossible 3 months ago had somehow become possible, and all because a cowboy had seen her standing in front of a burning cabin and offered help without expecting anything in return. The winter passed slowly, as winters do in Wyoming, with long, dark evenings and short, cold days. Hannah and Henry became unofficially engaged, though they decided to wait until spring to make it official and plan a wedding. Thomas approved wholeheartedly, and Rosa cried happy tears and immediately started planning a feast. The ranch hands placed bets on when exactly the wedding would happen, and Hannah pretended to be annoyed but secretly loved being part of this raucous, loyal family. In January, word reached them that Cyrus Maddock had lost a major cattle contract and was having financial trouble. Thomas heard through his contacts that Maddock had overextended himself buying up land and now could not pay his debts. It was a small piece of justice, and while it did not change what he had done to Hannah, it meant he was less of a threat going forward. February brought a blizzard that lasted 3 days and buried the ranch under 4 feet of snow. Everyone was trapped inside, and the close quarters could have caused tension, but instead it felt cozy and intimate. Hannah taught the ranch hands how to play the card game her father had loved, and Henry taught her how to do rope tricks, and they all took turns reading aloud from the few books in the house. On the 3rd night of the storm, when everyone else was asleep, Henry came to Hannah's room and knocked softly on the door. She opened it in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders, and Henry just stood there looking at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "I could not sleep," he said. "I kept thinking about you up here alone." "I am not alone," Hannah said. "The whole house is full of people. You know what I mean." She did. Hannah stepped back and led him into the room, and they sat on the bed fully clothed and talked in whispers until dawn started to lighten the sky. They talked about everything and nothing, and at some point, Hannah fell asleep with her head on Henry's shoulder, and when she woke, he was gone, having slipped out before anyone else woke. The blizzard finally broke, and the work of digging out began. Life returned to its normal rhythm, and Hannah marked the days until spring, impatient for the snow to melt and the frozen ground to thaw. She wanted to see her cabin again, wanted to start planting her garden, wanted to begin the life she and Henry had talked about. March brought the first hints of warmth, and in April the snow melted in earnest, turning the valley into a muddy, sodden mess that gradually dried into green grass and wildflowers. Hannah rode out to her cabin to find it exactly as they had left it, secure and weatherproof, and she spent a week cleaning and arranging, making it truly hers. Henry proposed officially on a warm evening in May, going down on one knee in front of everyone at dinner, and presenting her with a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. Hannah said yes through happy tears, and the whole household erupted in cheers and applause. They set the date for June, giving themselves just enough time to prepare. Rosa and Hannah spent weeks sewing a wedding dress from white cotton, simple but beautiful, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Thomas arranged for a preacher to come out from town, and the ranch hands built an arbor covered in wildflowers for the ceremony. It was going to be small and intimate, just the ranch household and a few neighbors, but Hannah could not have been happier. 2 weeks before the wedding, Cyrus Maddock made one last attempt to cause trouble. He filed a claim with the Territorial Land Office saying that Hannah had abandoned her property and it should revert to open range. But Thomas had anticipated this and had documented everything, from the partnership agreement to the construction of the cabin to Hannah's regular presence on the land. The claim was dismissed within a week, and the land office clerk let Thomas know privately that Maddock's reputation was so damaged by this point that no one was taking him seriously. "It is over," Henry told Hannah when they heard the news. "He has no power over you anymore." Hannah leaned against him, relief flooding through her so strongly her knees went weak. "I can hardly believe it. For so long he was this shadow hanging over everything, and now he is just gone. Not gone, but defeated. There is a difference." Henry kissed the top of her head. "You won, Hannah. You kept your land and you built a new life, and you did not let fear stop you." "We won," Hannah corrected. "I could not have done any of this without you." The wedding day dawned clear and warm, with a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Hannah woke in her room at the ranch for the last time, and Rosa helped her into the white dress and pinned her hair up with wildflowers. When Hannah looked at herself in the small mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back, this radiant, happy person who had survived so much and come out stronger. The ceremony took place in the yard at noon, with the whole household gathered around and the preacher reading from a worn Bible. Hannah walked out alone, no one to give her away but herself, and that felt right somehow, like she was choosing this life of her own free will and power. Henry stood waiting under the flower-covered arbor, wearing his best shirt and pants, his hair slicked back and his eyes bright with emotion. They exchanged vows, simple promises to love and honor and support each other through whatever came. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Henry kissed Hannah like she was his whole world, and she kissed him back the same way. The household erupted in cheers, and someone started playing a fiddle, and suddenly there was music and dancing and more food than Hannah had seen in months. They celebrated until the sun set and the stars came out. And then Henry and Hannah rode out to her cabin, which was now their cabin, to spend their first night as husband and wife. Someone, probably Rosa, had been there before them and lit lanterns and left flowers on the table and fresh sheets on the bed. It was perfect, private and romantic in theirs. "Are you happy?" Henry asked as they stood on the porch looking out over the land that now belonged to both of them. "I am happier than I ever thought possible," Hannah said honestly. "When I stood here watching my first cabin burn, I thought my life was over. I thought I had lost everything that mattered, but I was wrong. I had not lost everything, I just had not found you yet." Henry turned her to face him, his hands gentle at her waist. "You saved yourself, Hannah. I just helped a little bit. You are the strongest, bravest, most stubborn woman I have ever met, and I am so grateful you let me be part of your life." They went inside and closed the door on the world. And that night, they began their life together in the home they had built with their own hands, on the land they had fought for and won. The years that followed were not always easy, because life on the frontier never was, but they were good years, full of love and hard work and simple joys. Hannah and Henry expanded the cabin, adding rooms as they needed them, and they combined their land with the Sutton Ranch, creating a partnership that benefited everyone. Thomas grew older but stayed sharp, and he taught them everything he knew about ranching and land management and dealing with difficult neighbors. Cyrus Maddock sold out eventually and moved east. His dreams of empire crumbled by his own greed and impatience. Other families moved into the valley, good people who worked hard and helped each other, and the community grew stronger. Hannah became known as one of the best ranchers in the territory, respected for her knowledge and her fairness. And she never forgot what it felt like to be alone and desperate, so she always helped those who needed it. Their first child came in the spring of their second year together, a boy they named Thomas after Henry's uncle, who cried openly when they told him. He had dark hair like his father and his mother's blue eyes, and he was healthy and strong and loud. Hannah had been terrified during the pregnancy and birth, but Henry never left her side, and Rosa coached her through the labor with patience and skill. 2 years later, they had a daughter they named Grace, and she was as stubborn and determined as her mother from the moment she drew breath. 2 years after that came another boy they named James, and their family was complete, noisy and chaotic and full of love. Hannah taught her children to ride and shoot and work the land, and Henry taught them to be honest and kind and brave. They grew up wild and free in the way only children on the frontier could, and they knew they were loved beyond measure. On summer evenings, the whole family would sit on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun set over the valley, and Hannah would lean against Henry's shoulder and marvel at the life they had built from the ashes of loss. Thomas Sutton lived to be 82, sharp-minded until the end, and he died peacefully in his sleep knowing his ranch and his legacy were in good hands. They buried him on a hill overlooking the valley, and the whole community came to pay respects to a man who had been fair and generous and strong. Henry inherited the ranch as expected, but he and Hannah ran it together, partners in every sense of the word. Rosa stayed with them until she died at the age of 76, still cooking and bossing people around right up until the end. She was like a grandmother to the children, and they mourned her deeply, but they also celebrated the long, full life she had lived and the love she had given so freely. The children grew up and made their own choices. Thomas the younger became a rancher like his parents, taking over more and more of the daily operations as Henry's hair turned gray. Grace married a schoolteacher and moved to town, where she started a school for children whose families could not afford the fancy academies back east. James became a horse breeder, famous throughout the territory for the quality of his stock. Hannah and Henry grew old together, their hands rough from work, their faces lined from sun and wind and laughter. They still worked the land they loved, though not as hard as they once did, and they spent more time sitting on the porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard where Hannah had once watched her cabin burn. "You ever regret it?" Henry asked one evening when they were both in their 60s, sitting in the rocking chairs he had made for their 40th anniversary. "Staying here instead of selling to Maddock and starting over somewhere easier." Hannah looked out over the valley, green and gold in the setting sun, dotted with cattle and horses and the homes of their children and grandchildren. "Not even for a second," she said. "This is where I belong. This is home, and I found you here, which makes it worth every hardship." Henry reached over and took her hand, his grip still strong despite the arthritis that plagued them both. "I love you, Hannah Sutton. I have loved you since the night I saw you refuse to break, and I will love you until the day I die." "And I love you," Hannah said, squeezing his hand. "Thank you for saying you will stay with me for now all those years ago. It changed everything." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and the stars began to appear, one by one, in the vast Wyoming sky. The life Hannah had thought was ending that terrible night had actually been beginning, opening into something richer and fuller than she ever could have imagined. She had lost a cabin but gained a home, lost her solitude but gained a family, lost her innocence but gained wisdom and strength, and a love that had sustained her through 4 decades. The land stretched out before them, the land she had refused to give up, the land she had fought for and defended and shared. It would pass to their children and their children's children, but for now it was still hers and Henry's, bought with grief and determination, and the kind of love that only grows stronger with time. As the first coyote called in the distance and the night breeze rustled through the cottonwood trees, Hannah closed her eyes and breathed in the smell of sage and grass, and the faint wood smoke from the stove inside. She was home, truly and completely home, and she was loved, and she was at peace. That was all she had ever really wanted in the end, and it was more than enough. It was everything.